Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Community Development Block Grant webinar for certification training. My name is Rebecca Shademan, and I am one of the presenters for today's webinar. I'm joined by Steve Charleston, Evan Clark, Dave Hans, and Amber Ward. Amber is going to be serving as our moderator and technology guru and making sure we get all of your questions answered. And so before I turn it over to Evan and Dave to talk about program guidelines, Amber, if you could go to the next slide. I wanted to make sure that you guys know everything that we're talking about today. We're talking about program design, program guidelines, formatively furthering fair housing, limited English proficiency. We move to the next slide. So to keep everybody in the right mindset, so oftentimes program guidelines are developed during the time of application, but they are finalized during the special conditions timeframe of the CDBG process. So we're talking about some of the special conditions today, and these items would carry on throughout the implementation of the grant. If you move to the next slide. And so, like I said earlier, program design begins at the application stage and then it moves forward throughout the life of the project. Next slide. And Evan, let me know if I'm taking over any of your slides on this. So program design plan, it's usually within every single application we see, and it's helping you actually implement your project to be successful by the end of the CDBG agreement. And it makes sure that you are ready to receive CDBG funds. Next slide. So we have two CDBG activities that require program guidelines. The first is owner-occupied rehabilitation, and that is the rehabilitation of privately owned single-unit homes. And then the second is commercial rehabilitation, and that is the rehabilitation of privately owned commercial property. This activity is limited to exterior improvements, facade improvements, and correction of code violations. So we often see commercial rehabilitation in our downtown revitalization method of distribution. Next slide. And so I'm going to turn it over to Evan now because it's starting to get into program guidelines.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so we'll just kind of go over program guidelines. I'll give an overview of the owner-occupied rehab. So what really are program guidelines? They're really a step-by-step pathway for our applicants, really to complete the process and procedures in either CDBG owner-occupied rehab or the CDBG commercial rehab program. It's really an outline with all the rules and regulations that our applicants and processors should really follow, really for the project implementation. So go ahead, Amber. When you're developing your program guidelines, there should be a clear statement and purpose, really reflect the vision of the community, whether that's through development of formal and informal planning processes, but essentially your program guidelines are going to function as your rule book of the project that you're implementing. It'll really describe how it's implemented at the local level, and it'll have all the provisions and ensure compliance with both state and federal requirements. So you'll create your guidelines based on local unit of government, comprehensive plan, housing studies, findings of an informal study, or other results of implementation nuisance abatement programs. So a lot of different items that can be used to incorporate and develop your guidelines. You can also hire an expert to work with you, your community, or reach out to other communities for best practices. You'll also want to create a checklist, ensure that the local unit of government is reviewing each application consistently. You'll identify who completed the action and when the action was completed. You'll also want to make sure that there's no discrimination involved in your project too. So. The application spreadsheet, this is for you to kind of use for your process. You'll track the results of each applicant, identify the results of each of them. So if they're over income, if they withdrew, the unit was economically infeasible, it'll include your environmental review concerns, and then a letter of selection to receive the funds for rehabilitation. Those are just a few things in the spreadsheet there. Some other resources, the CDBG manual, Chapter 4 really helps out with developing your program guidelines. You'll want to make sure that your minimum rehab standards are included. There's a link there for our rehab standards. Lead-based paint, that's a big component of owner-occupied rehab. That's a link to the HUD information. Uniform Relocation Act, and then income limits. So you can find the updated income limits by going to our website there as well. All right, so specific owner-occupied rehab program guidelines, you'll really want to be familiar with commonly accepted rehab practices and procedures, which would include the applicable laws, regulations, and administrative requirements for CDBG assisted housing rehab. We always update our checklist for the application each year. So we provide a checklist. It's going to have all the items that you need to include in your program guidelines. So your program guidelines, reuse plan, checklist, it'll really help you walk through everything. So that's another tool to use as well when you're developing your guidelines. Eligibility criteria. Again, program guidelines are really the rule book, so we'll just kind of go through some of the steps here. So eligibility, those are the real big components of owner-occupied rehab. They need to be income eligible, the property needs to be eligible, and then if you guys are using a priority ranking system as well, that's an item to consider. Do you have any questions, Amber?
No questions yet.
Okay. So applicant income eligibility, CDBG, owner-occupied rehab, any individuals or beneficiaries, they should be at or below 80% of the area median income. For the county they reside in, it's based on anticipated gross annual income for the following year. We have a few links and tools here to really help you out with determining the income. Big item is just make sure you know the AMI specific for your county from the income limits, and then you'll determine income items from there, the CPD income calculator there. And then the webinar, the link right there, it's a little dated, but it's still helpful, helps you kind of walk through how to use that. And then if you're still unsure, there's the, it's a home guide for determining income, but those are tools you can use if you're not sure how to determine or how to income qualify a family. The next thing, the property, that's a big item as well. So property should be within the city limits of the local unit of government. It could be further restricted to a specific area or target spot within the community. Property has to be occupied by the owner, and it has to be the principal residence. It can't be owned and rented out to someone. The individual that owns it must occupy that unit. And then another big component, it needs to be economically feasible. So the amount of rehab that's going into it, or the amount of rehab identified in the guidelines, if you're going over that number, it's going to be considered economically infeasible. So make sure you do your due diligence on that as well. priority ranking system. It's not required, but communities, some communities like to implement this option. You can really focus on helping individuals within protected classes, so elderly or disabled. You can focus on lower incomes first, so someone at 40%, 50% AMI may receive a priority over someone at 80%. The priority ranking system, it just can't be discriminatory, so can't really be prioritizing just larger families. It should be within the protected classes there.
Hey, Evan.
Yeah.
We did receive a question, and maybe Steve wants to weigh in on this one too, but are there any conversations on increasing the $25,000 limit?
So Steve, you can talk about this as well, but I know it's been a conversation. Research has been being done, so it's something that's being looked into at this time, but there's no definitive answer right now.
Correct. There is no definitive answer. In other words, it's reviewed annually in terms of the amount that is allowable in terms of the cap. So.
And is that cap kind of associated with the lead-based paint rule? Am I remembering that correctly?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit there for me, Rebecca. Yeah, so I know the big thing with the 25,000 right now is there's questions specific to, is that just the lead-based paint or the total amount of funding provided to the unit? So it's an item that's being researched and clarified, and again, it's just not definitive at this time. So we'll continue to research and look and try to get an answer on that. I don't believe I talked about this section yet. So, okay, so you've identified income eligibility, property eligibility. So then really looking at your application process. So cycle of applications, your review procedure, your inspection and work write-up of the property, and then your formal notification of eligibility. So that's your income and property eligibility items. We'll talk a little bit about this item here, this section of your guidelines. So applications, do you want to take them in an open cycle, or are you going to take rounds? Something to consider, if you're doing rounds, there can be additional costs, time delays to open and close rounds. So whatever the community decides, if they feel like an open cycle or rounds is best for their project or their program, look at those items. If you're just doing an open cycle, make sure you include a statement in your guidelines that the first complete application will be the first served. The review procedures, your procedure to income qualify the applicants, specific example, and then eligible applicant. They have assets over the stated limit allowed, something to consider there. What's your procedure to verify ownership and liens? Typically, you're going to reach out to the courthouse, the assessor, register of deeds, an example there for an ineligible property. Say they're behind in paying their taxes, or they have a nuisance violation involving some type of litigation in their home. So just make sure in your guidelines you're explaining your procedure for those items there. Your inspection and work write-up of the property, your rehab specialist, they'll schedule a time to inspect the property and complete the work write-up and bid proposal. If the unit was built prior to '78, lead-based paint hazard mitigation. those will be triggered, they'll be required. So that's another thing with the lead-based paint. Again, if it's economically infeasible or feasible, what's your maximum amount identified in your guidelines? If you're exceeding that cost, it will be economically infeasible. And then another thing, property can't be located within a floodplain or shouldn't be within a recently impacted area by flooding events. So floodplain or flooding events are an important item there too. Excuse me. Your environmental review record or your tier 2. So your project, it's selected for award. As you're doing your special conditions, you'll do initial environmental review record. There's always going to be items that you're unsure of because you don't know the actual units or the location of the units. So you'll have to do your tier 2 based on that specific property. Big things, again, your floodplain. Section 106, you'll work with History Nebraska, State Historic Preservation Office, and the Tribal Historical Preservation Office. Radon, explosive hazards, toxic substances, proximity to the airport for noise items, and then any other applicable tier 2 items. So the link there, that's just a tool you can use kind of to go through and help you determine or work through your tier 2. Your formal notification of eligibility, you should have a standardized form or letter, should be used throughout your program. If an owner of property is ineligible, the letter must identify or state the reason why the owner of property is ineligible. If they're over income or there's an issue with the property, it needs to be stated and specified within that letter. Letters, they should be dated, signed, and on letterhead. And then you'll always want to keep a copy within your file of both selection and non-selection. Your types and terms of assistance, your program guidelines, they'll need to identify the type of assistance, the maximum amount allowed. Is it a loan and have terms to be paid back? So homeowner has to pay back the rehab assistance within a specific time frame. Are you doing a deferred conditional grant? So if they live in the home for a specific period, the affordability period, is the rehab assistance forgiven, partially forgiven? So there's a couple of different options that you can choose to use, but you have to identify within your program guidelines what are the terms and any potential payback items or payback terms within your guidelines. The affordability period should also be defined. That's the time period that the homeowner, they've got to reside in that property as their principal residence. Should have a lien reflecting the amount of rehab placed against the property for the length of the affordability period. CDBG, there's a minimum of 5 years from the date rehab was completed. You can always go above and beyond that 5 years, 10, 7, 8, whatever you guys decide. It's just got to be at least 5 years. More on the types and terms of assistance, recapture of funds policy. So if you have recapture, the total funds invested in the rehab of the home must be repaid if the period of affordability is not achieved. So if you have a 10-year affordability period and in year 7 they decide to move out, that would be an item or a specific example of this. Or say in year 7 they decide to start renting out their home and they no longer reside there as their principal residence, that would trigger this. another example would be is if someone passes away or they're deceased. So your program guidelines should outline what happens in those types of situations. They'd need to pay back the amount of rehab costs. So your terms, was it partially forgiven, fully forgiven? You need to just spell that information out. So you could have your prorated base or full repayment too.
Hey, Evan, we did have a question come in.
Yeah.
So it's going back to the floodplain. The floodplain crosses a corner of the owner's property, but does not touch a structure. Is that property ineligible?
Steve, I'll have you kind of clarify on this a little bit, but it depends on how much of the property is impacted by that floodplain. If it's just a little portion of it, or if it's, Steve, I might have you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that too.
That question arises whether it's owner-occupied rehab housing structure or other properties. So it's determine whether it's incidental or not to the property. So that's on a case-by-case basis. As an administrator at the local level, you would have a concern not only looking at the firm map, but also at actual history in terms of knowing whether that condition applies only to what's structured, laid out on the firm map, or if in real life, if that property has been underwater or not. So you'd have to take into consideration, plus you also have to go back and make sure that that community is in the flood insurance program. But so it's a case-by-case basis, and you would look at it. And if you have questions at the time, you could contact your representative and we would review for you. That's the answer to that question.
Okay. So some additional required items for your program guidelines. So you should always include a conflict of interest clause, your grievance procedures, your amendment process. You're always going to have DED approval in there as well. What's your compliance with the Fair Housing Act, your lead-based paint policy, specifically homes built before 78 and after. You'll want to identify how you plan to incorporate those items for those units. And then relocation, if it's temporary or permanent, your program guidelines are always going to want to have this in there that in cases where involuntary or voluntary acquisition is anticipated. I don't think the rest got stuck on here, but you'll want to identify DED before anything's done. So relocation, if you come across that situation, make sure DED is informed before anything's done. And then your marketing plan, how are you marketing it? How will it be affirmatively marketed? Collection of photographs throughout the rehab. Do you have before and after, during? You should have those. And then a voluntary release and authorization for publication form provided to all applicants. So those are some additional items of owner-occupied rehab program guidelines. And I think that's the end of my section. Before we turn it over to Dave, are there any other questions specific to owner-occupied rehab right now?
Nothing's come through yet.
Okay. Thanks, Amber.
Are you ready to keep going with this one, Dave?
Yes. Good morning. This is Dave Hans, and I am the downtown revitalization representative for the Department of Economic Development. And in this next section of slides, we're going to be covering commercial rehab program guidelines and processes for when you have a downtown revitalization award. Much of this materials or these slides are going to be similar to what Evan covered in the owner-occupied rehab slides, but obviously there are some differences. We would ask that if you have any questions, feel free to send them through, and Amber can notify me if any questions pop up during the presentation. So feel free to ask questions as necessary. I would also like to relate that there are in our CDBG manual, in Chapter 4 of the CDBG manual, there is a whole chapter on developing program guidelines, and this is for both the commercial rehab program and owner-occupied rehab. So if you have an award anytime during your administration career, CDBG certified administrator career, and you want to find details, you'll certainly be engaging with Chapter 4 of our manual. So to begin with, obviously you're going to become familiar with rehab practices and procedures and the applicable laws and regulations, city codes, and administrative requirements that govern CDBG commercial rehab activities. In the application guidelines and in the new Amplifund system, when you apply for or submit an application for the downtown revitalization opportunity or category, there is a program guideline checklist that identifies the various thresholds and requirements that the applicants must notify DED where within your commercial rehab program guidelines you're identifying the various requirements that we spell out in the threshold exhibit. You identify what page number you're covering within your program guidelines. Next, please. So obviously, when you begin your commercial rehab program, and even at the application stage, you will identify the eligible areas or the properties and the boundaries of your districts that where your slum and blight activities are going to be undertaken. This is a designated process that local governments go through so that they can comply with the slum and blight national objective. And please be aware that your slum blight designations cannot be more than 10 years old when you're applying for a project. If they are, you have to redesignate the area at an official council meeting and have minutes of it. So ensure that your properties are within your slum and blight region. We also require applicants to submit a map of your area with the application, and we do review that. Obviously, any property that you're going to be working with must be within the designated area. The property also must be economically feasible to be rehabbed. And what this means, you know, it has, if the cost of the rehab exceeds the maximum amount that a grantee identifies within their program guidelines, then this is considered economically infeasible. So if you have a guideline of you can only invest 50,000 in a property, and the business identifies that the cost to bring it up to code would exceed 50,000, then that project, by your guidelines, would not be eligible for the community to move forward with because it's economically infeasible. Next slide, please there. As Evan mentioned, along with the OOR, your commercial rehab guidelines can be operated in various manners that your community determines best fits their situation. You can have an open cycle of rounds. You can have an open cycle or rounds of applications. And if you have an application round, there can be additional costs and time delays to open and close rounds. From what I've seen, this is the most common application methods where communities offer a cycle where or a window of opportunity where they accept applications, and this will all be spelled out in their guidelines as well. They take applications during a period, make awards, and then award those. If they award all of the funds, obviously in the first cycle, they're probably done, but we have seen situations where they don't award all their funds in an open cycle or in a round, so they open it up again to take applications a second time if needed. The community will develop a priority ranking system. If they don't have any priorities, they'll have it spelled out where the first completed application is the first serve, the so-called first come, first serve method of awarding funds. And this will all be identified in their scoring process. Next slide, please. While developing the application review process, obviously there's going to be a committee that reviews applications. Again, the local government has the flexibility to design the committee as they seem fit. Obviously, there's going to be a lead, probably a review person or organization that reviews the applications and ranks and scores them while they award businesses the commercial rehab funding to improve their properties. The guidelines need to identify the entire application process from beginning to end, which includes the eligibility requirements, the implementation methods, and we also want to highlight that the Davis-Bacon and related acts do apply to the commercial rehab process when a project exceeds $2,000 of construction-related activities. So it's important that you're also aware of the Davis-Bacon and related acts requirements because as you implement projects, you will need to have to follow those if your project has construction costs of more than $2,000. There is also procurement required in the commercial rehab process where businesses need to provide and go through and get bids, and usually a couple, 2 or 3 bids to identify low-cost provider that are able to carry out the project and fulfill it through the life of a project. The application and the review process will also consider financial status of the business, and you will have also financial records through the completion of the project. So to identify eligible rehabilitation, the local government will spell out eligible improvements under your guidelines and definitions of what your activities are going to involve. And the very common activities are facades, restoration, renovation, replacement. This could be doors and windows, reconstruction, and addressing code deficiencies if you have code violations. Obviously, when you identify eligible activities, it's also to include and identify ineligible activities. And these can include or will include things, ineligible activities under DTR include purchasing of furnishings, equipment, or other personal property which does not become part of the real estate. Improvements completed or expenses incurred prior to the applicant receiving notification. So obviously you can't start a project until the local government gives you usually a notice to proceed. And if a business did incur costs prior to that, those expenses would be ineligible to be reimbursed under the program. Interior improvements are generally ineligible unless they're beyond public safety and code violations. Exterior improvements that are beyond facade improvements are also ineligible. Types and terms of assistance. This section's, also kind of commonly referred to as terms and conditions. Your program guidelines need to identify the type of program and the amount of assistance allowed. I talked about that earlier. If you set a maximum amount, you can't exceed that. And if a business owner identifies that his costs exceed your maximum allowable, that wouldn't be considered feasible. So either that business would have to scale back activities to come within your allowable cost, or they wouldn't be eligible. You set up your program with terms and conditions as usually the assistance is provided to a business under a loan that the owner would need to pay back the rehab assistance within a designated period of time. Or if you do a deferred conditional grants, the funds can be forgiven if the improvements remain for the full affordability period as outlined in the program guidelines, then the rehab assistance is forgiven. So you can structure your project as either loan assistance or a deferred grant if they fulfill all the conditions. Okay, the affordability period, Evan talked about this a little bit. This also applies to commercial rehab. This is the period of time that the improvements must remain intact at the business location. You usually have a start date of the affordability period that begins when the project is completed. So you'll have a date of completion. It's important that you start your affordability period after the project is started. The community will also oftentimes place a lien on the property that is reflecting the amount of rehab cost for the length of the affordability period. So with all collateral, when you're filing a lien, you need to make sure that you also follow through. If you have a deed of trust against the property, you want to make sure you file that at the county level so your lien can be enforced if necessary. The CDBG program also has a minimum of 5 years from the date of rehab was completed. However, the program guidelines can identify a longer period if the community wants to for your affordability period.
Hey Dave, we had a question come through.
Okay, yes.
So, says we will occasionally get requests from building owners to make code or public safety improvements to areas that are not accessible to the general public. So, for example, the second floor living units. Does DED have guidelines or suggestions on when these types of projects are eligible?
Well, code violations are an eligible activity. If Steve's is available, I may ask him. He has more experience with the DTR program, but it is eligible to do code violations. And I guess, Steve, do you have some comments about that and code violations and when they can be addressed?
Steve, would you like me to read the question again?
You can read it again.
We will occasionally get requests from building owners to make code or public safety improvements to areas that are not accessible to the general public. So, for example, a second floor living unit. Does DED have guidelines or suggestions on when these type of projects are eligible?
You would need to, first look at the eligibility under downtown revitalization in terms of living units. If that's an allowable, then you'd have to look at why the code violation is enacted. In other words, what are they violating? So if that's a violation that has to change the use of or an existing use within that structure on the second floor, that's not allowable in terms of the use of the building under downtown revitalization, that would be no. If it's related to the safety of the structure overall for the public, that's possible. Depends on how far they intend to stretch the improvements to that building, because firstly, you want to undertake those improvements to the building that tie directly to public safety of those persons, either in the building as, for example, owner workers, and those that are also in the building to purchase or partake in services. There are some situations where the property owner that has a business also lives and resides on the second floor. We've seen those in a number of cases on visits to communities. So you'd want to take those on a case-by-case basis. So I don't have a yes and I don't have a no. That's my conclusion there. We need to have more specifics on each situation. And then you'd want to look at your guidelines to see if that's permissible. And those rehab guidelines standards are presented to the department for approval. So, and go through a process. So I think it depends upon the type of code violation for one. That's the answer I have for now.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So for communities that have that situation come up, it's obviously a good idea to remain in contact with the program rep so we can address those on a case-by-case situation. Okay, back to types and terms of assistance and repayments of funds. If a business decides to change the project before affordability period is achieved, the owner may need to pay those funds back, whatever the cost of the rehab is. The grantee, the subrecipient could make the business owner pay those funds back. The program guidelines could be set up that the amount paid back would be prorated based upon the time period that the improvements were present. So what that means is if you had a 5-year period where the business owner had to keep the property intact or unchanged for a 5-year period, and the business owner did it for, let's say, for 4 years, the community could make them on a prorated basis pay back 1/5 of it if they achieved 4/5 of the affordability period. Next slide, please. So the environmental review record for commercial rehab projects. Generally speaking, when you are a new awardee, you have to get a release of funds, and the community will be undertaking a environmental review process. And generally for commercial rehab activities, it's probably a categorically excluded subject to obtain release of funds. However, then when you identify projects that you're ready to rehab, you're going to be undertaking the so-called Tier 2 environmental review process. And this is also addressed in the CDBG administrative manual in the environmental review section. And it's also very similar to the OOR process. But when undertaking before you're starting your rehab project, and after the property is selected for funding, you're going to have to identify if the project is in the floodplain and consult the appropriate agencies and authorities or websites. There is a Section 106 review that you'll have to consult the State Historic Preservation Office, who's now called History Nebraska, and the
Hey, Dave,
oh yes.
you kind of cut out there for both me and Amber, and we weren't able to hear you. So I think we heard all of the floodplain. Hopefully everyone else can hear Dave better now.
Okay, sorry if we had technical difficulty. Yeah, so floodplain is required review. I'll go back and cover the Section 106 again. That's a process that you undertake with History Nebraska, the State Historic Preservation Office. You have to contact them and provide an overview of your project on the appropriate forms to let them know the property, the address of the property that you're considering to rehab and the activities that you're going to undertake. And they will provide a written response to your contact to let you know um, any historical preservation methods or activities that they feel would be appropriate for you to address when undertaking the rehab of a property that the local government has selected to renovate. Along with that process, you're going to be contacting the appropriate agencies or websites to review if there's any radon that needs mitigated, explosive, hazardous substances and toxic substances, any airport authorities, or no noise situations that would need to be potentially abated or addressed. And you'll be reviewing the websites or contacting the appropriate agencies for those considerations. Okay, application materials that the local government will be obtaining oftentimes include photographs of the current structures, plans and designs for proposed changes, and cost estimates for the work to be undertaken. It's a requirement, or it's very important for the grantees or the certified administrators to review the system for award management process, or the SAM system for the name of the business or the property owner, to ensure that the business is on an excluded list. It's not on an excluded list, and they would be eligible for federal funds to be provided to them to improve their property. So make sure you review the SAM system before undertaking any activities. There is a formal process where the local government will notify businesses and of their eligibility or selection or approval of their project, or even notification that perhaps they've been turned down. The local government should have standardized forms and letters throughout your program. As I mentioned, if the owner of the property is ineligible, they should identify in a letter and state the reason why the property is ineligible or was not selected. The letter should be dated and signed and be on official letterhead. And subrecipients must maintain a copy of their notifications of either selection or non-selection for all their properties that have applied for the program. More on required items here. Your program should have written materials that address conflict of interest and any grievance procedures that applicants could undertake. Your program guidelines are also going to have to address, if you're going to change them, you go through an amendment process. Obviously, grantees are providing their application guidelines at DED review, but if any time a community decides to amend them, they have to go through a formal process to amend them. There is a acquisition or relocation requirements in your program guidelines. If a project causes relocation activities, the community may have to provide assistance to any relocated parties. So it's important to understand that you review, if you had relocation activities, that you review the CFR at 49 CFR 24.101 It's pretty unusual, or it's not very common, but if a community does undertake projects that require relocation, you're definitely going to have to comply with that. There is marketing plans. You should be um, identifying to potential applicants in your area, identify how the commercial rehab program will be advertised in a non-discriminatory manner, and you will be collecting photographs throughout the commercial rehab process. Keep them in your files, and the owner will provide voluntary release and authorization for any publications of forms provided to the applicants. The overview of the review process. So when grantees are awarded funds, as I mentioned, the local government does have to provide to DED a copy of their rehab guidelines or their program guidelines. And this is generally done at the time of application within the Amplifund system. And it's also a requirement. One of the special conditions is that you have to provide your approved program guidelines in order to obtain a release of funds. The DED staff will review your program guideline materials, and we will return to the municipality or its agency if any corrections are needed. As I mentioned, there is also a self-review checklist that applicants or communities go through, and they identify on the checklist the page where each requirements are included, what page number. So it's easier for DED to review the program guidelines. The municipality does need to adopt your approved guidelines, and then you will provide them to DED, and the DED program rep will notify the municipality that the approved guidelines have been received and approved, and the municipalities will submit the final version to DED for our files and yours, and also for the complete record. Yeah, just as an overview, the subrecipients or the grantees must follow their program guidelines as set forth. There is accountability and transparency needed, so businesses and members of the community know how the program guidelines work and what's contained within them. If, as I mentioned, a community decides to make any changes or deviations to the guidelines, the community must follow an amendment process. DED will be doing a monitoring process through the life of a project, and we will be reviewing your program guidelines and any client files from the program, including any non-select applications that have been received by the community. And any deviation from your program guidelines may result in a finding. So when you have program guidelines, it's important that you do follow them. And if you want to change them, you're certainly able to do so, but you have to go through an amendment process. So that concludes this session of the DTR program guidelines. Amber or Rebecca, did we get any additional questions?
I'm not seeing any questions, but if you and Evan can stay on the phone for a little bit, I was going to take over and share my screen on some resources to just add a little bit more clarification on commercial rehab and owner-occupied rehab. And then Steve, you could also stay on, that would be helpful. And Amber,
So
I'm going to
Rebecca?
share. Yes.
Before we move on, going back to the question on code violations and reviewing the guidelines in terms of the priority activities, the priority activities do not include housing, at least within the past 3 to 4 years. So if you have a issuance by the local government of a code violation that ties directly to housing on the second floor, the nature of the violation, and I don't know what violation that would be, but that's an item that the property owner will need to undertake on their own outside of the commercial rehab. There may be an exception if the property and the violation has a direct effect upon the first floor where the businesses or the business operates in terms of retail or service. So I would say in most cases, we're not funding those improvements that relate to code violations that deal with living spaces within that structure. End of conversation.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen real quick with everybody. And
Please do, thank you.
hopefully I do this correctly. Okay, so I just wanted to show everyone our website again. We talked about a lot of items within the commercial rehabilitation activities and the owner-occupied rehabilitation. So I'm going to go all the way back to last week when we talked about environmental reviews. So commonly, we do an environmental review record at the time of special conditions. And for these two programs, normally it is a CEST, although there are some exceptions. So the environmental review record would be a CEST, and you would complete the statutory checklist for that. So I'm going to pull up an example of the statutory checklist because we went really quickly over this at the end of it because we were running out of time. So here is what the statutory checklist looks like for a CEST. And you'll notice that there are 14 regulations within here. And you have to identify the impact the project has related to that regulation. So Steve mentioned during his presentation last week, you'll check either box A or box B. We have definitions here. So box A is the project is in compliance, either because the nature of the project does not implicate the authority under consideration or supporting information documents that project compliance has been achieved. So you're aiming for an A, but sometimes you cannot select A because you don't know what address you're actually doing work on. So oftentimes you have to do a secondary step. So oftentimes it's a box B. The project requires an additional compliance step or action, including but not limited to consultation with or approval from an oversight agency. So oftentimes you can figure out items such as coastal zone management from an overview, the broad review of the environmental review record. You already know there are going to be no coastal zone management issues because we're not near one. Super easy. So that one you don't need to evaluate again once you know your specific site address for that commercial rehab activity or the owner-occupied rehab activity. Normally, as we talked about in those slides, it's the contamination and toxic substances that has to be evaluated for each address. So we're going to just use that as an example right now. And Amber, you can see my screen, right? I did share correctly. Amber, I'm not hearing you if you're talking, but if either Steve or another panelist. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
we can see your screen. You're doing great.
Appreciate it. So the department has created a tier 2 form for our subrecipients to use. And hopefully this kind of keeps you on track of everything that you need to determine within this. And I'll let Dave and also Evan, because they work with more, and also Steve, they work with more projects involving tier 2. I do not have as much experience. So I'm gonna do my best. Those 3 people, if you could correct me if I start misinforming people, that would be great. So this is a sample form. It's on our website. It's within, I'll bring that up real quick. It's right here under CSG. It's also, if your project does trigger an EA, we also have it on here, I believe. Oh, I don't think we use this. Normally CESG. So we have tier 2. So then here we have air quality, airport hazards, contamination. So these are oftentimes the ones that we normally see cannot be determined when you do a broad overview. So you have to do a secondary review. So we do have this to help you out. So if you find that in your broad review that the Farmland Protection Act does not apply to your project, and when you did your initial consultation, you would not have to do that at each individual site location address. So keep that in mind. Steve or Dave, Evan, anything you want to add to this?
No, that makes a lot of sense what you said, Rebecca, as it applies to the commercial rehab or downtown revitalization properties. So thanks for embellishing and providing more clear and additional information.
So we'll take a look at your CEST, your broad overview that you submitted to us that we approved, give you release of funds. If you not indicate that you can't determine this at this point in time during the broad review, we'll be looking at your tier 2s to make sure you evaluated that at each site location. So hopefully that makes sense. But if you are new to a project and you were hired and you're working on a project that's under implementation, feel free to contact the department. We want to make sure you're doing this correctly and everything is good to go. So there are several regulations in place that we've talked about. Evan, is there anything from the housing, owner-occupied rehab activity you want to stress here on environmental review records?
No, nothing additional that you haven't already touched on. So thank you for showing that information there.
Okay. And Steve, I'm guessing that you're also okay with everything? Okay. So we did provide you a couple of handouts regarding program guidelines. So this is 01 handout that we provided you for today's webinar. And this is for owner-occupied rehab program guidelines. This is something that we actually provide as a component within the application to be submitted. We need to be able to find all of these items within your program guidelines that the local unit of government developed. So we do have this all clearly defined here. So if you're missing any of these items, we would not be able to approve your program guidelines and we would have you redo it, so to speak, or edit it to incorporate it. So all of these items in here. So if you do have a loan payment program set up, that creates program income. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow, but just keep that in mind if you're working with a program that has a repayment component back, or be aware that program income would be developed. And that's a very serious item that we both HUD at the top of the agencies looking into nationwide, and then we are also looking into within the state of Nebraska. So 2 other handouts that we did provide is also the commercial rehab program guidelines. If you are a brand new certified administrator and you're taking on a project that is under implementation right now, always review the application first, the program guidelines, see what file structure your predecessor had set up to make sure all of the components were being evaluated and everything was being tracked, because you want to make sure that all your records are in order and everything is compliant. So this is another handout we provided to you guys. And then 03 is the action by local unit of government. This is kind of a nice visual for that second to last slide that I think Dave Hans went over during his presentation. We referenced for the owner-occupied rehab program, we talked about income limits. If you go to the HUD exchange, I just went to programs, CDBG program, and then went to CDBG state. And then I go to the CPD income eligibility calculator. So off to the right side, they have all the income limits. The income limits for the CDBG program, they provide you an Excel document. It's just very hard to read. So you can use the home income limits like I discussed on last Tuesday's webinar. You can use these. I do have the 2021 home income limits coming up, maybe. So this provides you, and I can make this bigger. Okay, so for Antelope County, you would be using low income here, and this is your 80% income. So if you find an applicant who's applying for an owner-occupied rehab project, and they're making $40,000, and they're a person that are single person in that household, they're making $40,000, they would not be eligible to participate in the CDBG program of owner-occupied rehab. We do at the Nebraska Department of Economic Development have other programs that assist people above 80%, but for CDBG program, they have to be 80% or below. If you are assisting people that are higher than that 80%, that means you are not meeting the national objective and you're out of compliance with the implementation of your program, and that is a very big deal. And Steve gives a scarier talk than me, so hopefully you never have that happen. But if that does occur, and you did not account for all the income associated, please contact your program rep immediately to make sure you are how to correct the situation and what to do next. So, so these are updated every year. You'll notice here there's an effective date of June 1st, 2021. So this is, I believe, Evan, correct me around if I'm incorrect, I believe this is dependent on the application date. So if you have an applicant come in on June 28th, you should be using these income limits to determine if they are eligible to participate in that program. But if they submit an application and you're evaluating that in February 2021, you should use the income limits that are effective at that point in time. So you should be reviewing these applications fairly regularly and quickly. There shouldn't be too much of a delay. I think that is it. And then if you do create an income, terribly sorry. If you do use the CPD income calculator, this is just very helpful. There is a manual here if you need assistance. And then there's webinars on the side of here. So it's just very helpful. Definitely recommend using for the owner-occupied rehab programs. So, and you can also use it for these other programs they have referenced. So any questions, Amber, that we've received? Anything that I'm showing? Okay, I'm not hearing Amber at all, so I'm assuming there's no questions. I did want to let the group know that there is an upcoming event. We sent this out to late afternoon last Friday. And if you don't see it in your regular inbox, then it might have gone to junk. especially if you're a certified administrator that's being recertified. For those folks that are brand new certified individuals trying to get certification, you might not have been on the list. So I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of this. Section 3 webinar that we're hosting. This is regarding the new implementation of the rule that came into effect. And you can register here by clicking this link. We are taking questions that are coming up on Section 3. So take a look at the policy memo and the FAQ, and if you can't find that in your inbox, can you let me know? We'll resend it out just to make sure that everybody has access to it, to this group that's attending certification training and also all of our other listservs. So take a look at the policy memo. We did create an FAQ for folks, and overall, we want to make sure that webinar that we're hosting on November 1st is informational and beneficial for those attending. So, and also we are learning a lot about Section 3 here at the department. So it is definitely a learning situation for all parties. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions or any other items, Steve, Evan, or Dave, that you want me to show folks? Oftentimes we do have, we want to market the program, so that's why it is important to have pictures of your owner-occupied rehab and downtown revitalization programs. It inspires other communities, and we like to highlight them in press releases. So, and also our 5-year CDBG investment and impacts brochure, which we will be starting to work on in the next couple of weeks. So here's our most recent one. Hopefully it blows up. And we do try to feature each opportunity that we have put funding in to, kind of giving everyone an overview of our program and how funds are spent each year. So yeah. We'll be asking for stories on this. These are all CDBG funded. All the stories that we highlighted were stories that were submitted by certified administrators or local unit of government officials within there. Trying to remember if we have HER grant in this one. And also owner occupied rehab we highlight. So just to inform everyone, what the CDBG program does, because every year we are reviewed at the national level for budgets, and so it's always helpful to be continue year after year. So, okay, Amber, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go on to the next presentation. Dave, are you still on the phone?
Yes, I am.
We received a question on, can second story housing be part of the match for DTR commercial rehab activity? I'm guessing.
Like Steve said, second story housing is not a priority. I think we would have some issues if a community was identifying second story housing as part of commercial rehab match. Definitely because if you know the business owners actually didn't undertake that activity, and it would be hard to verify that they matched appropriately. So I guess we would prefer that the match be provided to the priority activity, which would be a facade improvement activity that would be on the main floor or the entrance to the facility.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
And then Amber, if you could share the presentation. Okay, so want to talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So Steve Charleston will be probably giving helpful hints throughout the next couple of presentations on next two topics. So, and feel free to ask any questions that you may have. So where does affirmatively furthering fair housing kind of step into the project? So the first time that the subrecipient sees it is within the special conditions of the CDBG agreement. So Amber, if you can go to the next slide. So here's an overview. So at the time of special conditions, we are asking for a fair housing action proposed to be undertaken during the lifetime of the grant. So that is we do review what you are proposing, and we do need to approve those actions and make sure you are affirmatively furthering fair housing for the grant. And then we do a double check to see if you actually implemented those actions. So if you don't this could actually hold up the closeout of your grant. So please keep that in mind when you're figuring out your implementation schedule of when you're implementing those fair housing actions. Next slide, please. So affirmatively fair housing, furthering fair housing is associated with Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 as amended by the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. So this law seeks fair housing practices throughout the United States and prohibits any person from discriminating in activities associated with housing because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, handicap, and familial status. So in some states, they have added on to these 7 core active items here, and however, Nebraska has not. So these are still standard for Nebraska. Go to the next slide, please. So CDBG subrecipients make a commitment to affirmatively further fair housing in the community as a recipient of CDBG funds. This is a commitment to understand every individual's fair housing rights and ensure all local policies practices do not hinder fair housing and when appropriate, actively further fair housing. That is a mouthful to say every time. Next slide. So within our CDBG program for the state, we want a local contact to be identified. That's preferably an employee or elected official of the local government as the community fair housing representative. They actively promote fair housing and ensure potential fair housing are reported to the appropriate agency. So oftentimes in bigger communities, we have someone who it is one of their main jobs that they are doing. In smaller communities, we often see it's the local clerk. So you also need to inform the department of a specific action that you'll undertake to further fair housing and clearly document the action was taken in the project in your files. And this can include newspaper articles, meeting and board minutes, contracts and agreements with workshops, presenters, sign-in sheets, websites, and video files. Next slide. Some form of action, not just passive compliance with existing laws and ordinances, not limited to those subrecipients of the housing activity, must be undertaken by all DED CDBG subrecipients each time a grant is awarded. Fair housing choice, ability of a person of similar income levels to have available to them a like range of housing choices regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. Local governments are in the most effective position to promote fair housing. Next slide. So we've have some standard minimal actions only by a subrecipient village that is a first-time recipient of CDBG funds with permission from DED program representatives. So bare minimum would be adding the Equal Opportunity Fair Housing logo to official letterhead, display posters, logo, and informational materials on fair housing, and pass the fair housing resolution. and include other actions that will reflect some type of action other than just the posting of info. So remember, this is really going to be rare because NDED's been implementing the CDBG program since 1982, I believe, if I remember from Steve's presentation back on last Tuesday. So we have actually awarded almost every local unit of government in the state at this point in time. So hopefully every local unit of government has this logo on their letterhead. They have posters, information materials at their offices available to people. This should already be being done. So if it's not, I'll be surprised, but feel free to contact your program rep. And next slide. I'm gonna share my screen real quick. And I wanted to show you guys one more piece. Let me do that. So we have completed I'm gonna bring it up first. If you go to our reports page, we have to, in order to receive CDBG funds each year, we needed to complete an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So if you want to take a look at this, it is very interesting, the data that we gathered and the implementation of items that are occurring in the state. So I'm just going to take a look at, show you guys kind of the analysis and areas that we focused on within this. Socioeconomic overview, segregation, integration, racial or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, disparities in access to opportunity, housing needs, housing analysis. I would take a look at this. So if you don't have a community that has done a housing study, you could take a look at this to see where are they falling within the state analysis. We reviewed the entire state. Except for Omaha and Lincoln, they do their own report. It is very interesting, the breakdown of some of the maps and where everybody falls. Trying to see if I can find any maps super quick. So just taking a look at our population, again, this was just done in 2020. So a lot of the information is still very relatable, what's going on. So okay, I will stop sharing. And then do we have any questions? Okay, so we do have a couple questions. At one point, DD did not allow community to use the same fair housing action in subsequent grants. Is that still the case? Yes, but you also need to think about who's your audience for that. So if you every year have the third grade elementary school do a coloring contest about fair housing, you get a brand new batch of third graders each year. It's not the same students doing the same activity with the same parents. So you need to think about who is doing that activity. And then Steve, can you think of any additional examples that you've seen within smaller communities and then examples you've seen in bigger communities?
Can you define smaller and bigger?
Sure. Any
I'm only
small.
kidding, but
Okay, great.
when in a number of cases, when you talk about villages and you move up into communities of sizes of 1,000, or the key here is that in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, you identify the achievement or what you're going to undertake. And most communities already have done a number of items through the history of that community. So if you're saying, I'm going to publish this notice, I'm going to post this notice, okay, how are you going to assure that that notice is going to be viewed? And how do you assure that notice is going to be communicated to persons within your community that, in essence, you firmly further fair housing in those actions that you take that are non-discriminatory? A second example is we receive a number of items that are listed. This individual is attending this training. Well, that individual attending that training, when that training is completed, what did that individual take away from that training? Who presented that training? What's the level and the participation in the training? And then what are you taking back to the community to improve or to distribute as far as the training attended? And what type of training? So how does that make an improvement? So a lot of times we are also looking for, if you're conducting an item yourself, tenant-based training or working with lenders, and you schedule those events, well, how many attended and what was the outcome? So firmly furthering fair housing is a federal law that's tied to the CDBG program and other HUD programs. So there's a number of cases, and if you have, for example, awards in the same period of multiple awards, you don't undertake the same for each award. So I've seen where they come in, you have 3 awards and the firmly furthering fair housing is identical in each. That doesn't meet the standard of what we're looking for. So a good example is what Rebecca said. So if you are undertaking and passing out pamphlets and brochures and making them available, you need to keep a record so that at the end of that, you can identify to us how successful that was and how you carried that out. So there's a number of, it goes beyond just submitting to us a statement on the local government's letterhead saying, for firmly furthering fair housing, the village or city or the county of will do this. Those are my comments, Rebecca.
Thank you. So, like Steve said, you can send someone to the conference. If you do send someone to a conference, one of the questions I ask is, can I see that they actually attended? And you'd be surprised how many people did not attend. And so they would have to do propose a different fair housing action for us. And we would have to approve that. And then they would have to implement that new one. I think what Steve was mentioning is if you have someone go to the conference, there should be action steps taken after they attend the conference of do they need to review their policies, procedures, maybe they learn new information that the local government is currently not in compliance and following, are they updating that? Kind of talking about what are they taking away from that conference. Documentation of you could have a booth set up at your local community celebration regarding fair housing, getting people to sign in and gathering information on there. That would be helpful and expose additional people to the laws of fair housing. I believe South Sioux City has a rental inspection program that they usually highlight with fair housing and provide additional information. And that was something that they incorporated within their local regulations. So if you want to learn more information, you can go to those websites, look up those laws And then also we do have information within our manual. That's chapter 5, starting on page 6. Cool. So we will take a quick 10-minute break. If you guys have any questions on any of the material that you have been presented so far, feel free to type those in the chat. We'll take a couple moments before going into LEP to talk about those questions you've submitted, and we'll try to get as much answered for you. Cool. Talk to you guys in 10 minutes at 10:45. Welcome back, everyone. I am not seeing any new questions on my Q&A, and I haven't heard any from Amber, who has lost audio privileges, so she's messaging me in the background app. So we will start off on limited English proficiency. Next slide. So limited English proficiency, you'll start seeing this reference at time of application and special conditions, and also throughout the life of the implementation of the program. So at time of application, you see it referred to as an exhibit. O, we ask for individual applicants to submit a 4-factor analysis analyzing limited English proficiency in their community. And then we get a more finalized version with special conditions submission. So next slide. So we see it first in time of application, which is not on this overview page, and I should probably add it. And then we see that months 0 to 3 with special conditions. And then we also see it being implemented throughout the entire project of CDBG. So if you go to the next slide. So some key definitions here that we're going to talk about are beneficiary, the ultimate consumer of HUD programs and receives benefits, limited English proficient person, individuals who do not speak English as their primary language and who have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English because of national origin. Next. Vital document, any document that is critical for ensuring meaningful access to the recipient's major activities and programs by beneficiaries generally and LEP persons specifically. Language Assistance Plan, LAP, is a written implementation plan that addresses identified needs of LEP persons served. Next slide. The purpose of this training is to provide guidance regarding the responsibility to provide limited English proficient persons access to federally conducted programs and activities. This is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's a federal law which protects individuals from discrimination on the basis of their race, color, or national origin in programs that receive federal financial assistance. Failure to ensure that persons who have limited English proficiency can effectively participate in or benefit from federally assisted programs may violate Title VI. Next slide. So some applicable policies and laws going on here is Section 601 of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act states no person shall be subject to discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin under any program or activity that receives federal assistance. Prohibited actions per HUD regulations 24 CFR 1.4, denials, differences in treatment, limits on services and facilities subjected to discrimination. Next slide. Law versus Nichols, 1974. This is a U.S. Supreme Court stated that one type of national origin discrimination is discrimination based on a person's inability to speak, read, write, or understand English. We also have Executive Order 13166 that was issued in August of 2000, mandated improved access to federal assisted programs and activities for individuals who, as a result of national origin, are limited in their English proficiency. Next slide. We also have the U.S. Department of Justice. They there is an executive order issued regarding guidance. I'll let you guys read that. And then there's also final guidance that was adopted in June of 2002. Next slide. So as a result of the above mentioned federal laws, Nebraska Department of Economic Development is taking steps to provide meaningful access to its programs and activities for persons with limited English proficiency. DED's policy is to ensure that staff and subrecipients will communicate effectively with LEP individuals, and LEP individuals will have access to important programs and information. DED is committed to complying with federal requirements and providing free, meaningful access to its programs and activities for LEP persons. Next slide. So, responsibilities. So, who are required? So entities that are recipients of any federal financial assistance and any recipients of community development block grants. So the Nebraska Department of Economic Development is a recipient of CDBG funds. This law then applies to all of our subrecipients, which is the local units of government. What needs to occur must develop a plan for persons of different national origins that cannot speak or read English. Why are we doing this? To ensure that they provide meaningful access to all portions of their program or activity, not just those portions that receive the funds. Next slide. So talking about responsibilities here, federally assisted recipients and subrecipients of the Community Development Block Grant are required to make reasonable efforts to provide language assistance to ensure meaningful access for LEP persons to the recipient programs. Slide. So recipients, sorry, I did a find and replace and that did not work well for me. So that should be subrecipients located there. So please forgive me throughout the presentation on this. Should conduct a 4-factor analysis specific to the project receiving federal funds. And this is something that you do at time of application and are required to submit to the department. And then depending on what you find in that 4-factor analysis, you may need to develop a written language assistance plan, an LEP, ensuring that the local unit of government provides meaningful access to all portions of each of their programs or activities, not just those portions that are receiving funding. You'll also need to provide appropriate language assistance and then keep records of all interactions with non-English speaking individuals and the type of assistance provided. So you keep a log sheet throughout the implementation of your grant. Next slide. So let's talk about what is the 4-factor analysis. Well, it contains 4 main questions. The first one is the number or proportions of LEP individuals served or encountered in the eligible population. The frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with your program, activity, or service. The nature and importance of the program, activity, or service. And then what are the available resources and cost? So these are 4 questions that you are asking to the local unit of government themselves of what activity am I applying for CDBG funds? Who are the individuals served, encountered? How frequently will they be encountering this project? What's the CDBG project? What is the importance? And what activity resources do I have available as I'm implementing this CDBG activity? Next slide. So sometimes after the 4-factor analysis, and it is determined that you have a very high population of individuals that are impacted by your CDBG project, you may need to develop a language assistance plan. So this will address the identified needs of the LEP population that the community serves. So often we relate it as an LEP. We do ask for this. Historically, we've asked for the LEP either at time of application or at time of special conditions needing to be submitted to us. I believe with 2021, we are now asking for that at time of special conditions. I think in years prior, it was at time of application for both of these. So, so this plan is referred to as an LEP, and is plan and policy combined into one. It represents that a subrecipient has a policy of providing LEP persons meaningful access to programs and activities, and also lays out the plan for providing such access. Next slide. So a LEP will likely be the most appropriate and cost-effective means of documenting compliance and providing a framework for the provisions of timely and reasonable language assistance. Note, subrecipients are strongly encouraged to develop a LEP. However, some subrecipients, such as those serving very few LEP persons and those with very limited resources, may choose not to develop a written LEP. So it's not required unless you have several LEPs. So it is very dependent on your service area of your project, your community. Just because you say for small community A, that's not required. Well, you travel 50 miles, that could be a completely different scenario. You need to evaluate and do the 4-factor analysis to determine what works for the community. Next slide. So a subrecipient that does not develop a LEP must be able to provide information to the department that demonstrates sufficient reasoning for not doing so. It must document alternative ways to articulate in some other reasonable manner a plan for providing LEP persons meaningful access to programs and activities. So that's oftentimes discussed in the 4-factor analysis on the last question of what resources are available. And those smaller communities speak to what they would do if they interact with someone who does not speak English. Next slide. So an LEP should include an explanation of the procedures the subrecipient will use to identify LEP persons whom they have contact, the size of the LEP population, and languages of LEP populations. Points and types of contact the subrecipient may have with LEP persons. So when would the local unit of government interact? What areas of the project would interactions occur? Identify those. Ways in which the language assistance will be provided. The subrecipient's plan for outreach to LEP persons. The subrecipient's plan for training staff members on the LEP guidance and the LEP, including specific provisions for training of staff who are responsible for completion and oversight of projects. A list of vital documents to be translated, the languages into which they will be translated, and the timetable for. And the plan for translating informational materials that detail services and activities to be provided to beneficiaries. Next slide. So the plan for providing appropriately translated notices to LEP persons, the plan for providing interpreters for large, medium, small, and one-on-one meetings, and ensuring the competency of interpreters. Oftentimes you can do a contract for services on this, or you may have staff members employed by the local unit of government who can provide translation, like a police officer. The plan for developing community resources, partnerships, and other relationships to help with the provision of language services, provisions for updating the 4-factor analysis in LEP, identification of the subrecipient's LEP contact person, and references to applicable LEP resources. Next slide. So we do have a couple of requirements with LEP. All subrecipients must use the 4-factor analysis to determine whether they should provide reasonable, timely oral language assistance free of charge to any beneficiary that is LEP. Depending on the circumstances, reasonable oral language assistance might be an interpreter or telephone interpreter line. There is no safe harbor for oral interpretation. Reasonable availability is expected based on the 4-factor analysis. So you have an individual come in, you should do, for the best of your efforts, try to assist. Next slide. Written material safe harbor. HUD has adopted a safe harbor for the translation of written materials. So safe harbor means that if a recipient provides written translations under these circumstances, such action will be considered strong evidence of compliance. Next slide. So here is a breakdown on the safe harbor for the table for written materials. So depends on the size of the language group. So when you are conducting your four-factor analysis, you are gathering data on your size of the population and the LEP individuals within that population. So if the group is 1,000 or more in the eligible population in the service area or among current beneficiaries, you need to translate vital documents. More than 5% of the eligible population or beneficiaries and more than 50 in number, you need to translate vital documents. More than 5% of the eligible population or beneficiaries and 50 or less in number. We need to translate the written notice of right to receive free oral interpretation of documents. 5% or less of the eligible population or beneficiaries and less than 1,000 in number. No written translation is required. Next slide. So that chart is very valuable. I would print that off, have it somewhere handy for you as you're evaluating, especially if you'll be working with several different local units of government as a certified administrator to ensure that you stay in compliance with LEP guidance. So expectations for compliance. Subrecipients should have a process for determining whether new documents, changes, programs, services, and activities need to be made accessible to LEP persons, determining whether changes in demographics, services, or needs require reevaluation of LEP, and seeking feedback from the community of the plan services. Next slide. So we do have template information available. For example, use the following paragraphs in public notices and other publications. We have English there, and then also there is Spanish. However, when you are doing your four-factor analysis, you may find that Spanish is not the other language that is popular in that local unit of government. There could be another one: German, French, Arabic. There are just so many languages out there that are spoken in Nebraska. So that's key to your four-factor analysis, is you're assessing what other languages are the most popular. Please note that address and name itself should not be translated. This is the requirement for anything that requires for you to publish. Next slide. So we will include this as part of our regular project monitoring on evaluation of compliance with LEP requirements. So a couple of things that we're taking a look at is, do you have an LEP contact person? Have you completed a four-factor analysis? Should be easy because we require it at time of application. Does the subrecipient have an LEP? We'll take a look at your answers to the four-factor analysis to see if, based off of the data, if that is a requirement, you should have triggered a LEP. Oftentimes, if you provide information to us on how you would be providing services to limited English proficiency persons within your four-factor, you'd be okay. Are LEP persons being provided meaningful access to programs and activities? Is the subrecipient maintaining records regarding their efforts to comply with Title VI LEP applications? So these are questions we're asking, and that you also need to be aware when implementing projects. Next slide. Penalties for non-compliance, repayment of federal funding, receive, loss of federal funds, loss of future federal and state funding, HUD, equal EEO commission investigations, subject to legal actions from legal services organizations and private individuals. The U.S. Department of Justice or the Office for Civil Rights still have the authority to investigate claims of discrimination. Next slide. Best practices. The subrecipients submit language assistance plan using the recommended template from the department. We do have templates for both the language assistance plan and also the 4-factor analysis for you to use. Feel free to make it align with that local unit of government's regular policies, procedures. Reach out to the community, communicate that those types of services are being offered by the local government, hang up LEP signs, and be prepared to provide assistance to persons with limited English proficiency, document and keep records for monitoring and reporting, be prepared to report annually. Next slide. Ensuring competence of interpreter or translation services, training of staff, bilingual staff. So staff members that will regularly meet with individuals that do not speak English should be trained on what procedures are in place to ensure they can communicate with those individuals that don't speak English. Posting signs in common areas, advertising language services and outreach documents, partnering with LEP grassroots faith-based organizations and schools, using telephone voicemail menu, and providing notice on non-English radio and TV station. Next slide. A couple of resources available here. We have videos that were created regarding Executive Orders 13166, language access plan, and I'm not sure if these links would work on your off of your. I'll send Amber. Can you make a note that we need to send the links because I don't think they work off of the handouts we provided. So we do. Next slide. So there are videos available. Oh, we are finished with the PowerPoint there. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick. Hopefully. Okay. There is a website appropriately named called lep.gov. I believe I'll double check that the videos that we referenced, I believe they are located on this website, but I'll double check that those are the links that we sent to you directly. And look at that 21st anniversary of Executive Order going on right now. Take a look at this website. They do have featured videos for you on information here. Take a look. Again, something fun to do when you need a break from doing everything else that you do. We also, as a department, have to put together our own limited English for 4-factor analysis and limited English proficiency. This is on our reports page, located right here. Feel free to take a look at it. We also have an introduction statement, history, breakdown, and then we also talk about our 4-factor and the data. So something to keep in mind. You guys can take a look at ours if you need assistance. And then you can also take a look at lep.gov here. Are there any other questions from folks? Amber, I'll stop sharing quick and see if I can take a look at the Q&A. I'm not seeing any questions come in that I see. I'm going to check the chat from Amber to see if she sent me any. Steve, is there anything else you want to add regarding 4-factor analysis, LEP, LAP?
Not directly. I would encourage you, when you move in to an LAP, to actual plan to document. So especially when you have an owner-occupied rehab project, when you have intake. So there may be those situations where your intake is in more than one language in terms of forms, but to keep a record, Rebecca mentioned, it's extremely important to keep a record. You may determine that you do not need to go to a language assistance plan, following your 4-factor analysis in terms of how you looked at it, whether it's in a safe harbor or not. But please remember that if you are contacted, meaning someone comes in to ask information, and that individual unable to communicate in forms of reading, whether it's reading in terms of another language they need to have, or literacy, that you need to make sure that you have and can provide available an individual to assist that person. But the record keeping is really important. Anything else, Rebecca?
Some folks have asked in the past if an adult comes in and they do not speak English, but if a child of theirs speaks English, and they have the child translate. The answer is no. The child does not know all the words you are saying, so it is not clear if they are translating what you are saying correctly to the adult. So you would need to find someone else besides the child to do the translation. So please keep that in mind.
That's true, but it may give you a lead in the very beginning of the conversation, at least to know what the person's asking about. So
yeah.
In that case, but no, the translations aren't between the youth, the member of the family in that case, especially a child.
So if you are working in a area for owner-occupied rehabilitation and you do your 4-factor analysis and find that there is a really high population of folks that do not speak English, you might want to think about translating some of your notices or connecting with local organizations that work with those individuals to make them aware of that owner-occupied rehabilitation program going on. Also, if there are streets, think about your environmental review record. And if you are doing a project that would have an impact on folks, maybe the streets would be closed to going to a specific employer route. You may want to think about, how do we notify the folks here that this environmental review record has an impact on them. Overall, think about how you are communicating with folks to make them aware of the CDBG project and resources available to them.
So another example, during the implementation of the project construction, especially if it's taking place in an area where persons are wondering why, they may come to the city office and ask questions, so you may need to be able to provide an individual to assist them. And especially when you do a second public hearing, be prepared in case there is the fact that the project is maybe impacting persons in the community and they want to know what is happening. So I think if you can identify those resources that connect with populations that do need assistance, that's very beneficial, as Rebecca mentioned.
Well, we did have a question on if we have information in our manual on LEP, and we have it very, like, a few sentences within chapter 5, and I don't think that's the level of detail that individuals asking for. Overall, we provide the 4-factor analysis templates and the LEP template, but I would go to that website that I showed you, and I'll have Amber email that out to the group after the presentation to make sure you guys have access to that. As you can tell from today's presentation, CDBG is just one regulation, but is intricately intertwined with several different other regulations. So just from the day we've referenced NEPA, which is another regulation. We've referenced procurement. We referenced Davis-Bacon related acts. We referenced limited English proficiency. We've also talked about affirmatively furthering fair housing. We are very layered with federal regulations. So if you have questions, we try to answer them as much as possible because this is very complicated federal regulation program, but it does do a lot of good. Okay, Amber, I'm not seeing any more questions from you or the people submitting in the Q&A. So we will nicely end early today at 11:15. All of your conference materials should be available through that ShareFile link we provided you guys. If you're having problems, let us know, and we'll make sure it should be the same link that you used to get webinars 1, 2, and 3 from last week. So, but feel free to let us know if you need help. We'll start again tomorrow at 9 a.m. And then if you have any questions, we're still trying to answer all the ones from last week and try to get you guys out an email this week. But feel free to send Amber any questions you have so we can get those all answered. I think that is it. Steve, can you think of anything else we need to remind people on?
I would remind them to review the manual. And looking at those chapters, there are, as we go through the presentation, there are some revisions, some of those more significant than others. So I would definitely review procurement and chapter 2 on the administration. So those are not the best of readings if you're looking for something to entertain you, but factual they are. So I would definitely take a review of those chapters that deal with general administration and procurement. And then if you have some thoughts that haven't been answered because you're not sure of how to ask them, especially on environmental review, please do send us, because it's extremely important. For one, as Rebecca and others went through today, and we did on the environmental review, when you speak of a tier 2 review, where it's category excluded subject 2, that you are taking the tier 2 to the level that it needs to go, and that in terms of those 14 items, authorities in the statutory checklist, that you've identified those that are appropriate for a tier 2, whether it's commercial rehab or owner-occupied rehab. And then I would also have a healthy lunch today. That's it.
Yes. And if you please register for the Section 3 webinar that we have on the events webpage. But you guys have a great day. Thank you for joining us, and I'm glad we could finish up early for you.